My levels of hype for the Winds of Winter are higher than they've been in quite a long time. This is something that I've wanted to talk about for a while now, but I'm glad I kept putting it off because more and more little things just keep popping up. So today we're going to be going over a few little rumors, a few blog posts, and why I think that there's a good chance we're going to be getting Winds of Winter pretty soon. I'm also going to be going over what you could call a leak that, in my opinion, gives the best explanation of why the Winds of Winter has taken so long. Then, once we've established what I think is the most likely theory for why the books have taken so long, we're going to go back and do a little bit of math because it's actually pretty interesting to take a look at and try to figure out what it means for getting the actual ending of the series with A Dream of Spring. So, we're going to start with some George R. R. Martin blog posts, and the first one that gained a little bit of buzz towards the Winds of Winter is the one where he said words of wisdom and then had a quote by William Faulkner about dreamers being lonely. All of this together with a blue winter rose at the top of the blog post definitely generated a little bit of buzz with a bunch of people talking about it, wondering, well, Winds of Winter, Words of Wisdom, they have the same initials, he's talking about dreams. Could he be on to Dream of Spring? Is the Winds of Winter almost done? This post also came several months after he had revealed he had met with his British publishers, which is something that happened when Dance with Dragons was finished. He met with his publishers. Several months later, he posted on his Nada blog about how Kong was dead, and then Dance with Dragons was done. This blog post definitely did get me a little bit hype, but it was something that was not concrete at all, right? It's a lot of connecting dots and things like that, and the fandom has done this many times over the years, and it's always led to disappointment. I would say that this alone is not enough to get hyped over, but there are a few other things that are adding on to it. The next thing from George's Nada blog that gets me a little bit hype and feels a little bit more concrete to me is something that he said talking about the upcoming Dunk and Egg series. For those of you who don't know, Dunk and Egg is based on a series of novellas that George is also in the middle of writing. He's got the first three of them written, but there are like nine or so more planned. I think the number has changed a little bit over the years as to how many more he thinks there's going to be. But in any case, they have enough material for 3 seasons, and then after that, they're going to either just have to go based off of outlines he gives them, or, as George himself seems to be hoping, he will have had time to finish some more Dunk and Egg novellas by the time season 3 is done. And he said that he will only do this after he finishes The Winds of Winter. Now, obviously, this is a few years out in the timeline if we're going to be getting at least 3 seasons of Dunk and Egg before this sort of deadline George has set, but the fact that he feels like he could potentially finish The Winds of Winter in the next couple of years and write multiple novellas for Dunk and Egg, well, that to me feels like he has to be thinking he's at least pretty close to finishing Winds. Now, he's obviously felt like he's been close to finishing Winds before, and that's something we're going to get into later on in the video. One of the most notable times where George felt like he was close to finishing Winds was when he made a promise that if he wasn't done with the book by Worldcon 2020 when he went to New Zealand, they could imprison him in a cabin above a lake of sulfuric acid until he finishes. Now, he obviously didn't have the book finished by that deadline that he set, and he also obviously wasn't imprisoned in a lakeside cabin in New Zealand for these last 4 years. But something that's interesting is the fact that for the first time since making that promise, George will actually be attending Worldcon 2024, which apparently is about a week after the end of House of the Dragon Season 2. So we'll put a pin in that for now because it feels like that could end up being relevant if indeed there is an announcement to be made. That feels like a place that it could be done. In terms of some more reason to suspect there could be an announcement coming, we have to talk about a leak that came from an account that honestly I'm not super familiar with. If I get this wrong, definitely someone who knows more, let me know down in the comments. But the way that I heard this explained is basically this is an account that gets a bunch of anonymous tips and rumors because they're a source that can, sort of amplify the rumor. And basically, you get a lot of situations where people who don't have any sort of platform end up becoming privy to some information that they feel will be relevant, and they would go to people like this to sort of get that information out. And this is obviously a thing that does happen from time to time. There are situations, maybe it's someone famous from your hometown, or maybe it's something that you know because of the job that you have, where you end up privy to some information that would be of some public interest if the rest of the world knew about it, but you know about it a little bit ahead of time for whatever reason. I have had this happen a few different times in my life with some famous people who are from near where I grew up, or some people who I knew growing up that became famous. And obviously, I've never gone to the press with anything crazy or anything like that. But at the same time, if I was going to do that and I had some really interesting information that I felt like people needed to know, going to an anonymous account like this that would keep you private and still get the information out there does make a bit of sense. But of course, this also invites people who just want to troll or make things up to also go and provide anonymous tips to accounts like this, so you don't really know if you can trust it. It's got like a 50-50 track record from what I've been told. I assume that they do some amount of vetting to try and sort of verify these things while keeping their sources anonymous when they post, but that may be the case, it may not. I don't know. That's just what I would do. I would try to do some vetting if I were running an account like that, but at the same time, maybe they do just post whatever they're told. All of this to say that this account posted a rumor that a famous author from New Mexico has hired catering for an upcoming book release party, and that they had requested a dragon shaped cake. Now, the clear implication of the way that this is all phrased is that George has hired catering and has requested a dragon shaped cake for the Winds of Winter release party. Can we trust this random rumor? I don't know, but it seems like it might be trustworthy. As someone who has both known famous people and worked in catering, both of those options are ways that you could find out some information. There are definitely times where I have booked catering that, if it was of some massive importance to tell everyone, hey, there's this catering event coming up, I would have been in a position to tell people. Now, unfortunately for younger me, when I was working in catering, I never had anything of this magnitude that I got to work on, but at the same time, I think you can see how it would make some sense that someone could be a source of anonymous information like this, and that they would actually know what's going on because, yes, this stuff does have to be booked a little ways in advance. This is one of those rumors to me that I think you really just have to take entirely in context. Could it be completely made up? Yes. Could it be completely true? Yes. The only way you're going to know is to just wait and find out. And if you want to try and get a little bit ahead of the game, the best thing that you can do is just look at other context clues and see if it makes any sense. Given the little things that I've talked about before that seem to be pointing towards George being optimistic about finishing wins, and given the things that I'm going to talk about next, it does make some sense in context that, to me at least, this rumor could be true. George could be hiring catering for an upcoming Winds of Winter party. He may also just be throwing a big party for House of the Dragon Season 2. That could also make some sense, and you could sort of see how that could get mixed up if the catering people are whispering behind the scenes. George R. R. Martin has a big premiere party that we're going to be catering. Some people may take it to mean Winds of Winter, when in reality it could be House of the Dragon. I guess we're just going to have to wait and find out. Also, just to add a little bit more context and prove that I'm not completely alone here in my optimism, YouTubers The Dragon Demands and Quinn the GM have recently also put out videos talking about how they too are getting very optimistic about the Winds of Winter coming soon. I would definitely recommend you check out both of those videos after this if you are interested in some more Winds of Winter optimism. One of the things that the Dragon Demands brings up that I think is very important and could be a really good sign is that apparently about a year ago now, George R. R. Martin told his helpers basically, like, hey, stop working on side projects, world books, sort of things like that. All hands are sort of on deck for a potential Winds of Winter release because George apparently feels like he is sort of close enough where that makes sense to do. If this is indeed the case, and George has been telling his people for about a year now that he feels like he may be close enough where they should stop doing other things that would make him and his publishers some money, well, that is a pretty strong sign that he actually probably is pretty close. Now, one of the last things that I want to talk about in this video is something that I haven't seen covered basically anywhere else, and I kinda don't know why it's as ignored in the fandom as it seems to be. That is the fact that a couple different times now in the fandom, there has been basically a leak of why the Winds of Winter has taken so long, and both of these different times, a couple years apart, they have basically said the same exact thing, and they seem to be coming from different sources who are at least as believable as that source about the whole cake incident. Is this something that we can know for certain is true? No, not until George finishes the book and then tells us what the holdup was, which he will probably do the way he did with Dance. He didn't say what the holdup was until after it was done, but then when it was, he came out and explained the Myronese knot. I feel like there could be a situation where the Winds of Winter is finished and he comes out and tells us that this is exactly why it took so long. So, the thing that has been leaked that makes the most sense to me about why The Winds of Winter has taken so long is basically that George has now had to write the book two different times. So, a few months ago, there was a thread on Reddit asking how many people believed the idea that George basically had to start a full rewrite somewhere around 2016 or 2017. This was met mostly with people saying, nah, George has completely given up, he's never gonna finish, he doesn't care anymore, all sorts of those comments that show up every time The Winds of Winter is brought up. Given how far we are into this video, I'm sure there are many people who didn't even make it this far that have already left comments like that down in the comments section. But one of the comments sort of seemed to confirm this idea, and it was matching up with some comments that had come out years ago at this point that were basically saying the same thing, supposedly from inside sources. So starting with the leaks from a few years ago, the comment is going to be up on your screen now, and the user who is now deleted is Brendan B. Fish, who was a sort of power user on the Song of Ice and Fire Reddit. Many people within the Reddit community who have been around a long time will know who he is. I'm not exactly sure what caused him to delete his account, maybe someone down in the comments knows more about that, but in any case, he was someone who would have been possibly reached out to if someone had inside information about the Winds of Winter, which is basically what he seems to be claiming has happened. According to his source, George was trying to write The Winds of Winter in a similar way to how he wrote Storm of Swords, which he basically wrote in a white heat, just page after page was flowing out of him, and he wasn't going back over it all and editing it until he got to the end when he did a big full editing pass, and then the book was able to come out. And apparently, while it worked really well for Storm of Swords, it backfired for Winds of Winter. Basically, when George and his publisher took a big look at the entire finished manuscript, it needed more than just some editing, it basically needed a bunch of rewrites. Which, when you take into account how all of the characters in The Winds of Winter are probably going to start meeting up and the story is hopefully going to start collapsing back together a little bit more, you can sort of see how it all turned into a giant Myronese knot sort of situation. One of the things that George talked about a lot with the Myronese knot being difficult is when exactly he timed Quentin's arrival in Marine, and apparently he wrote many different chapters, all with Quentin arriving at different times just to see how it would play out and how it would affect Daenerys and the storyline. Given the way that George writes and the way that these characters sort of fall together like dominoes or a big Rube Goldberg machine, you can sort of see how having to do significant rewrites to a book may lead to having to just rewrite the entire thing. Now, George has not come out and fully said, hey, I had to start over and rewrite the entire Winds of Winter, but at the same time, this does line up pretty well with some other things that George has said. Most notably, how George seemed to think that he could genuinely get the Winds of Winter done in 2016. Which is obviously insane in hindsight, given that it's been 8 years, and if he only thought he had a few months of work left, how could it have possibly taken 8 years? Well, it gets a lot less insane if you factor in that he probably had to go through and do a full rewrite, which is, again, something that has now been leaked multiple times. The first one is the one that I described there by Brendan B. Fish, and he also talks about how it made sense that George thought he could have this book done in 2015 or 2016, but then major rewrites are the thing that held it up. And the second one is one that I'll go over just quickly in case you are just listening and not, looking at the comments on the screen. Basically, this person claims that they were talking to someone who worked at George's publisher, and they were told around 2018 that, yeah, George submitted a full manuscript for the book, and it was a big mess, and he had to go back and do significant rewrites, and that the book is not going to be coming out anytime soon, which again was supposedly relayed to this person around 2018. Just given the leaks that we've talked about, paired with George's confidence that he could have potentially been close to being done in 2015 or 2016, all of this just really adds up to me to make this the most likely scenario for why Winds has taken so long. And another good piece of evidence in my mind is what happens to the math when you start looking at the time between book releases, factoring in this idea of a rewrite. So let's break this all down and try to figure out how the timeline actually looks for progress on the Winds of Winter. First, A Storm of Swords came out in 2000, A Feast for Crows in 2005, and then A Dance with Dragons in 2011. So, as you will notice, we had a 5 year gap, and then a 6 year gap, and then now here we are sitting on a 13-year gap. And people were already noticing, well, the time between books was increasing. The first few books came out with like 3 or so years in between them. Then it was a 5 year gap, and then six. Now we're at 13. Obviously, this means that the gap is just constantly growing, and we're never going to get Winds of Winter or Dream of Spring. At least that is the pessimistic viewpoint. If George had been writing The Winds of Winter through one time this entire time, and you were just taking like a page count style sort of progress count, it would make a lot of sense to be pessimistic and assume that George has either completely stopped writing or at least drastically slowed down. But let's go back to that pattern we were talking about where it's been basically taking him 1 year longer to write each book, and factor in that he probably began a rewrite somewhere around 2017. This would mean that you could basically count him as having written a book and finished it in 2017 or so, but it was just not publishable, so he had to go back and write another book starting in 2017 or so and finishing hopefully around 2024 or 2025. So, when you factor in the fact that much of the end of A Dance with Dragons was cut and pushed back into The Winds of Winter, you can sort of take into account that he had part of The Winds of Winter written, and so that may be why it took him a little bit less time if you're saying he finished in 2016 or 2017. That is a 5 or 6 year gap from the last book coming out in 2011. So that's a little bit shorter than the pattern. But if he had to do a complete rewrite starting in 2016 or 2017, then it has now taken him 7 or 8 years if he is indeed close to being done. Basically, the point is that instead of a complete pattern break, The Winds of Winter, if you factor in the rewrite scenario, is basically keeping with the pattern that George has had for the last several books. It may be taking him a year or so longer to write each book, but it's not doubling the length of time the way it is when you factor it in as 13 years for The Winds of Winter. Basically, the way I look at it, there are two ways you could measure George's writing either in the total number of pages that he writes, whether they end up published or not, or you say that I'm just a results based person, I only care about when the main books come out. If you only care about when the main books come out, then yeah, sure, his writing progress has obviously slowed down significantly. But if you factor in things like rough drafts and the fact that George has told us many times how he writes chapters and then rips them up and writes them over again because he needs them to be better or he needs them to fit together differently, I think it's reasonable to assume that his writing, like pages wise, has probably stayed relatively consistent with what he's been doing for the last several books of the series. It's just that Winds of Winter is a much more complicated book with a lot more converging storylines and a lot more Myronese knots for him to untie, and all of that to me just makes a lot of sense. It doesn't help, it doesn't get the book to us any faster, it doesn't erase the 13-year wait that we've had to go through, but if you're looking to make some sense of it and have some reason to believe that George hasn't just been, going several years at a time without working on Winds at all, this is the way that you would do that. And again, to me, it just does make the most sense. I've seen people try to put together timelines of George's progress where they basically point out, well, he had a bunch of the book left over from what was cut from Dance, and we know he was writing a bunch during COVID. So obviously, that means that between when Dance was published and when COVID started, George was obviously writing nothing. He had no pages, he had taken a decade off, he's given up on the series, he doesn't care, all the sorts of conclusions that fall out from that line of thinking. But if the whole rewrite situation that I've laid out here, that, as I said, has been leaked a few different times, is actually just what's going on, then suddenly you have the Occam's razor solution, in my opinion, the one that is the cleanest and just makes the most sense with all of the given information that we know. And what's great is that scenario gives you some reason to be optimistic. First of all, it is optimistic because the math says then that if that pattern holds where it's taking, a little bit longer to write each book, it should be maybe 6 or 7 years to write each book, maybe 7 or 8. And given that it's been 13 years and he's had to write the book 2 times, well, if it's 6 or 7, that equals 13. So even if it's a little bit longer than that, I would say 2024 or 2025 would be when we could expect the Winds of Winter, just based purely on the math, if he did in fact have to do a 2017 rewrite. The other really interesting thing that happens to the math if you factor in this rewrite scenario as what actually happened, and all of a sudden George hasn't broken his pattern and he's putting out a book every, 6, 7 years or so. If he had to write Winds twice and he's almost done with the second one, the timeline is much more optimistic for how long it will take to get a Dream of Spring. If you were doing one of those like complete the pattern math problems and your pattern is 5, 6, 13 question mark, you're going to assume that the next number in the pattern is greater than 13, and therefore the Winds of Winter taking 13 years means Dream of Spring is a long ways away, maybe 15 years or more. I think, having been in the fandom for quite a long time, this is generally the pattern recognition that has led to so many people basically saying George is never going to finish this series. But again, if we factor in the rewrite scenario, all of a sudden the pattern is 5, 6, 6 or 7, 6 or 7 again for Winds of Winter take 1 and take 2. Then your next question mark all of a sudden makes a lot more sense if you set it at 8, 9 maybe tops, right? That's a lot more optimistic. Suddenly, rather than looking at the pattern and seeing even if we get wins in 2025, you're looking at a Dream of Spring in 2040. Instead, you'd be looking at, I don't know, 2032, 2033. That's a lot more reason to be optimistic that George can finish the series relatively soon. Now, obviously, that would require him to not have any major rewrite issues with The Dream of Spring, and it would require his writing progress to go well, which, in his own words, he has said sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. Also, if you haven't already, this is probably the time where you could call me a sweet summer child down in the comments. So, with all of this being said, and all of these different little things sort of adding up, if you were asking me when do I think the Winds of Winter is coming, I would currently bet on 2025, with a potential upside of being released in late 2024. If George is actually completely done behind the scenes, it would make a lot of sense that he would be waiting for an announcement either at maybe the season finale of House of the Dragon Season 2 or at Worldcon, which is about a week after that. Now, maybe that's a little bit too optimistic. I'm not entirely sure. I definitely think it's within the realm of possibility. And as I said, I'm not alone. Definitely check out Quinn the GM and Dragon Demands videos after this if you want some more information and some more good takes on why it's time to be getting optimistic about the Winds of Winter. But let me know what you think about all this down in the comments. Do you think that I'm completely crazy, or do you also start to feel the hype building up and see the math lining up and think that maybe this is the best explanation for why Winds has taken so long, and that maybe we are indeed going to get Winds soon? George hasn't given up, George just had to do a bunch of rewriting. Thank you all very much for making it to the end here. Make sure to like and subscribe, maybe share this with someone who has completely given up hope about Winds of Winter to try spread a little bit of that optimism. I do understand why the fandom has grown so pessimistic, but I do definitely think it's time for some optimism to start coming back to the Song of Ice and Fire community. Thank you again for watching, and I'll be back with something else very soon.